All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Davis, for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'd love to just start kind of at the beginning. So you first grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'd love to actually just know first, what was that like? What was the Birmingham that you remember? But then also, what was your household? Like, what's the dinner table at your house in that time in your life?
Well, yes, I grew up in a family of educators. My father was a teacher, and my mother was a teacher. Birmingham at that time was the most segregated city in the country. And it was absolutely segregated, literally. As a matter of fact, I didn't actually get to meet white people on an egalitarian basis until I went to New York. I was quite young when I went to New York, so fortunately I was able to, witness life that wasn't governed by those regimes of racial segregation. My mother was an activist. As a matter of fact, my mother met my father because she was doing organizing work with the Southern Negro Youth Congress, with which W.E.B. Du Bois was associated. So these were some members of the Communist Party, black communists, and others. So there was a campaign called the Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad, Victory Against Racism at Home. And so my mother was involved in recruiting my father to join the army. He actually did not go overseas. He taught at one of the bases in Georgia, I think. So, yeah, I always say that as difficult as one might imagine living under regimes of segregation might be, I learned a great deal. And I was fortunately surrounded by people who were challenging racism from the time I was very young. So I don't ever remember thinking that this is the order of things. This is the way things should be.
This is natural, right?
And my mother always, and I've told this story many times, whenever we children would be upset because there were things we wanted to do that black kids weren't allowed to do. The amusement park, for example, the museums, the libraries. She always explained that this is not the way things are supposed to be organized. This is not the way things are supposed to be. And they will change.
So there was a sense of possibility in the household.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I always say, I think I ultimately became interested philosophically in critical theory precisely because I had the experience of learning how to question things as they existed and to simultaneously inhabit that world, but also a world that was constructed by possibility.
How did they, well, what do you think gave your parents a sense of hope that the world could be different?
Well, I think it was being active and being around other people who felt that way. Their closest friends were from New York and had come down to the South to do organizing of workers, but also organizing in connection with the early instantiation of the civil rights movement. So I don't ever remember thinking that this is the way the world is always going to be. And then because my mother was studying, getting her master's. She did that during the summer, so she traveled to New York and took all of the children with her.
Okay.
And we got to experience New York. My first trip to New York, actually I went by myself, was when I was 6 years old, visiting their close friends, the Burnhams. And I should say that we lived in the same projects in Birmingham. But at one point, Bull Connor, who people know because of the damage that he tried to do to the movement there, the sicking dogs and fire hoses, high-power fire hoses on children. This same Bull Connor actually ran my parents' friends out of Birmingham and forced them to return to New York.
And did your parents, were they committed to Birmingham, or did they want, was the feeling that not only is this wrong and we can change it, but also we should change our own circumstances? Or was it a conscious decision to stay?
Well, they had already left their homes because they grew up, both of them grew up in the country.
Uh-huh.
And so Birmingham was a big city.
Yeah.
And I think, they were supported by, my mother was supported by the YWCA. And she actually ran away from home. She had foster parents in a place called Sylacauga, Alabama, a little, country town. And she actually ran away from home in order to be able to go to high school, because that was the only high school for miles and miles around that where black people were allowed to get an education. And then my father grew up in another country town.
Right.
And he actually came to Birmingham to go to school. And he became a teacher himself, and she became a teacher. And all of the teachers that I had, I'm not talking about my parents now because they never actually taught me, but the teachers were dedicated to giving their students a sense of the possibility that existed in the world.
Yeah.
And I always saw them as bulwarks of resistance. When the white representatives of the Board of Education would come around, they would talk back to them. They would, especially the women who would be called by their first names by these white men would speak up and challenge them. Some of them ended up getting fired.
Yeah.
So we got to experience that as kids, and I think that I have no memory of a time when I didn't know resistance. One of the stories I often tell is that in the neighborhood where we lived, the neighborhood was zoned so that white people lived on one side of the street. Center Street was the dividing line, and they allowed black people to move in on the other side. My mother and father bought a home there, right across the street from the white neighborhood where it was illegal for us to even set foot. But as kids, we played these games where we would dare each other to run across the street, even though we knew, of course, what the consequences could possibly be. And there was someone we knew to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan who lived right across the street from us. And we always dared each other to run across the street and run up the steps and ring the doorbell of the Ku Klux Klansman. And that was fun. There was no
the
heaviness
insouciance
about
of youth.
that.
Yeah, that you have your ideas about risk are frivolous, sometimes dangerously frivolous, but there's possibility in that. There's a willingness, there's a lack of inhibition to try. I mean,
And there's also joy, because we were having fun.
Right.
And I like to tell that story because resistance isn't always only about a
Struggle.
serious struggle. It's
Yeah.
also about generating
Joy.
happiness and joy.
Well, right. I mean, it's interesting that so much of your, as you relate it, so much of your childhood is about, right, is about the possibility in resistance, the joy, the generative nature of resistance, the joy in resistance, but also the agency over knowledge. That a sort of agency over knowledge is itself a form of resistance.
Absolutely.
And what, talk more about risk. Like, did you have a sense of what the risks were? Did you acquire a sense of what? Because of course, a part of the way an order like Jim Crow segregation keeps itself in power, right, is to violently inscribe you into an understanding of what the risks are, right, to make them plain to you. What was that? What was that like? I guess in Birmingham, but then also kind of moving to New York in the Northeast. How was that different? I assume it wasn't absent in New York and the Northeast, but it was different.
I moved to New York as a student when
Right.
I was 15,
Right.
and this was 1959.
Right.
So the first phase of what people refer to as a civil rights movement was already unfolding.
Right.
But the really dramatic moments were yet to come. So I was, as a matter of fact, I remember being very sad that I had left Birmingham precisely when things began.
Oh, because you could feel it beginning to precipitate.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Oh
okay.
yeah. Yeah. Yes. As a matter of fact, one of my classmates, who was the daughter of the major civil rights leader there, Fred Shuttlesworth, her name was Patricia. She was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus. Many people think that the first one
Right.
to do this was
Right.
Rosa Parks,
Right.
but this happened all the time. As a matter of course, as a matter of fact, it was only because of that particular conjuncture that happened in 1955, and the involvement of large numbers of black women, domestic workers, supporting her, that we now assume that the beginning of the movement was resided in Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus, and people think of her as someone who made an emotional decision that
Right.
day and
As
don't
opposed to being
know
part of a coordinated
exactly,
movement. Yeah.
exactly.
I mean, did you feel left out when you
I
moved to
did.
New York?
I
You
did. I did. I mean, I was involved when I was in New York because I remember during that period, I picketed Woolworths every single Saturday. I was attending a high school, progressive high school, so virtually all of my classmates were progressive. So I got to participate, but I wasn't. I wasn't where I thought I needed to be.
Did New York acquaint you with like a different face to racism? What was your experience of race in New York?
Well, yes, of course. When you consider that I had grown up in an almost entirely black community, my mother had some white friends, but it was illegal. And so I can remember my mother driving a friend of hers who was white, and the white woman had to lie down in the back of the car because when you saw a black woman and a white woman in a vehicle, it was always the white woman driving because the black woman was her maid, right?
Right.
So I can very clearly remember the ways in which we felt that risk. I remember my father pulling a gun out of his drawer when strange noises were heard outside to check to see whether the Ku Klux Klan had set a bomb. My very first formal participation in the movement was at the age of 11. an interracial discussion group at the church I attended, the First Congregational Church in Birmingham. And we met for a while, and then the church was burned.
Yeah.
So yeah, and bombings took place. So it was scary.
Yeah. It's so explicit, right? And the menace is so explicit. Was New York menacing in that way? Or what was I think of, one of the things that sometimes we hear in our discussions about race today, sort of the people will talk about the feeling of being the uncertainty. Like, is racism the cause of this thing? There's some opportunity that's being denied or missed, and part of what is so frustrating is not the explicit menace, but just the kind of the crazy making uncertainty. Like, was this racism or not? And that itself is a kind of oppression. Like, you're at the opening moments, the opening phases of this sort of this the largest movements for civil rights in almost 100 years in the country. What was it like in New York? Did New York just think it was on the right side of history and people felt in league with you, or was it
Well, I mean, I did. I thought.
You thought that?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very much a sense of feeling liberated.
I see.
And it was not until I had been in New York for a little while, maybe 6 months, that I began to feel a sense of discomfort. But I didn't have the language. I didn't have the concepts. I couldn't refer to that as racism because we had as yet no developed discourse,
Right.
no developed popular discourse on racism. So I felt uncomfortable when so many of my classmates invited me. I should say I went to a high school that was an independent school, private school, we used to call it. And most of the students came from families that were, pretty well off.
Yeah.
And they had servants. So I would be invited, for example, to visit a classmate's home for dinner or something like that. And I can remember some instances in which the parents then invited the black servant to sit down at the table because I was there.
Oh, because you were there.
Yeah, but, I felt troubled, but I couldn't explain what I was feeling. It took me a long time to develop the words. And at the same time, I had an absolutely amazing experience.
Yeah.
I loved that school and what I learned. I read the Communist Manifesto when I was 15. I had a Marxist for a history teacher.
This was all documented by law enforcement authorities over the course of your life.
Absolutely.
What do you? I mean, did it? Of course, it influenced you. I guess the question is, how did it? I couldn't imagine two more different places in the late 50s, early 60s than Birmingham and New York. And yet, both on a spectrum, right? To the extent that this is a national problem for our society with historic amplitude, they're different places, and yet they are places that represent different locations on a continuous spectrum. How did that influence sort of your later, more developed thought about the problem of racism, about what it is?
Well, I was quite active during my high school years there. I was introduced, as I said, I was introduced to Marxism, but also I was spending time with my parents' friends who were in the Communist Party.
Yeah.
So I became involved in the youth organization of the Communist Party. And I began to consider myself a revolutionary at that time. One of my good friends, Kathy Boudin, who unfortunately passed away 3 years ago, her father was the attorney for the new revolutionary Cuban government. And so I was introduced to Cuba at that time. It was, I mean, it was an amazing experience. It opened my eyes to internationalism, and I kind of remember thinking that I may not have found the ideal society here, but there's a world out there, and I developed these desires to travel, which I did after my first year in college. I went to Europe, France. I ended up studying in Europe, studying in Germany.
What were those, what was that, I want to ask about where you went to college, but what, how did Europe influence you?
Oh, very much so. Um,
What did you find, especially when you were in, I know you went back to Europe, of course, for a period, but what was it, what did you find when you went as a college student?
well, when I traveled to Europe the summer after my first year in college, I was at Brandeis University. I ended up learning about the Algerian Revolution. And I was introduced to Frantz Fanon before he had been translated into English.
Wow.
So I, I, I felt that I was on a kind of trajectory that was leading in the direction I wanted to go. New York was the first goal, and I thought that I would be able to experience a world without racism there, which I did, but I became active. I learned what it meant to be a young activist at that time, marching across the George Washington Bridge in protest of the, what we then called the atom bomb. I learned, what it meant to think globally, the solidarity with the Cuban Revolution when I was 16 years old. So that was really a very pivotal moment. Later, when I was at Brandeis, I learned about the Palestinian struggle from my Jewish classmates. And not long ago, I wrote an article in the online journal Hammer and Hope that's edited by Kianga Yamada Taylor. And it gave me the opportunity to reflect on how the theme of Palestine just kept showing up in my life, which I appreciate, and being able to explore the similarities between the black struggle and the Palestinian struggle. So yeah, I think that every institution where I studied, offered me far more than I could have ever imagined. Studying in France, French literature, and even today, I draw on that sense of the importance of literature and art and culture, and how we can't build movements that are effective in terms of imagining and creating a new world if we don't recognize the centrality of art and culture.
It's interesting. So much of the, I want to ask why you went to Brandeis, but I have to say, a lot of the, and it shouldn't surprise us that it's hyperbolic and misstated, but a lot of the criticism and commentary that you've attracted over the course of your life is so doctrinal. So the fascination with your affiliation with communist movements and the Communist Party is so doctrinally focused. And what's interesting, sitting here talking with you, is how it's so the opposite. It's experiential. You're talking about looking out to the world, recognizing there is a world. You're talking about culture and aesthetic experience and the way that constitutes a form of knowledge. I think the gravitational pull of ideas. Why do you, why do you think you've been so misread? I mean, some of it is obviously just in bad faith. Or maybe here's maybe a different version of the question. Why what as a society it seems easier for us to be sort of identitarian and doctrinal. Why is it hard for us to see these ideas through the prism that moving from Birmingham to New York opened up for you, through the prism that going to France opened up for you? What is the challenge you think? What is the challenge to our social imagination?
Well, I think it has a great deal to do with the influence of capitalism. Not only the economic system, but the ideologies that are uh, dedicated to the preservation of a kind of world where some people will never have the opportunity to have the kinds of experiences that human beings need to have. I was attracted to communism because I saw poverty in Birmingham. I was very fortunate to have parents who were able to make a living. I'm not saying that, they were wealthy, far from it. I got a full scholarship to go to Brandeis, for example. But but we were not those who experienced absolute poverty in the way that some of my neighbors experienced, in the way that some of my mother's students. As a matter of fact, early on, my mother told us that we were not going to have the new shoes that we wanted because she had to provide shoes for her students. And she had to provide clothes for her students. So we learned early on that we might have to wear our shoes even after a hole had developed in the sole by putting pasteboard in the... and we knew we were doing this not because my parents could afford to buy us shoes, but because they were trying to help others. So that's something that has always been seared into my memory. Why is it that some people, by virtue of who knows what, I kind of learned afterwards, are forced to live in the kind of poverty that no human being deserves, and others do much better. So I was actually reflecting on that problematic from the time I was very young. Mm-hmm. And I think this is why I was drawn to Marxism, because it helped me understand the historical dimension of that question. And it also helped me to understand that it might be possible to build a world where everyone had those opportunities.
Right. Right. This is a project that it can be resisted.
Exactly.
That it's not natural.
But see, that's dangerous when vast numbers of people begin to think this way, because it threatens the very basis of capitalism, which is, always placing the needs of profit over the needs of human beings.
Well, something it strikes me, we're also seeing today, and again, this is maybe getting a little bit ahead to just contemporary reflections, but I when I look, one of the things I was going to ask you about later is you've seen there's been a reorganization globally around the axis of sort of what is liberal and illiberal is shifting, and you're seeing a range of leaders that we would call illiberal succeeding in what we would otherwise have described as sort of liberal environments, right? So Modi in India, whether they are liberal or not, but you're seeing Bolsonaro, Orban, yes, Trump exactly. Obviously in the United States, you're seeing a range, you're seeing a kind of leader that we hadn't seen in advanced democracies in a long time. And it strikes me that so much of the appeal of these leaders is not just the way that they seek to defend entrenched interests who do benefit from an economic system that produces, obviously you might argue requires, a high degree of material inequality. But they also seem to be benefiting from people who don't do well in those systems, but value the structure and clarity it provides them, right? I mean, that
I don't know whether it provides them with clarity.
Uh-huh.
I would slightly
Yeah.
transform your question.
Please.
It places them in a situation where they have nowhere to turn, because they aren't supposed to
So
be.
it's docility.
Yeah, and they don't see. I mean, I've been thinking since the first election. Well, hopefully it will be the only election of Trump. That that we as activists bear some responsibility for that development, given that we did not place enough focus on organizing those who are really suffering as a result of the nature of global capitalism. Because there came a point where it was no longer possible for working class people to move out of that. And of course, the ideology that we receive focuses on the middle class, and not so much on a structure that requires a class that will always be exploited. And at this point, given the development of global capitalism, where people have no way out. And so I was actually have done work around prisons for a very long time. And back in the 80s, back in the 90s, it was really clear that the period of the 80s was the development of global capitalism in the way that we know now.
Mm-hmm. To transition to service-oriented capitalism, financialized capitalism.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and it was also a period of deindustrialization for the advanced democracies, advanced capitalist countries, and the consequences of that deindustrialization, and at the same time the collapse of the welfare system created the kind of massive incarceration of vast numbers of people who could no longer find a job because the factories, the industrialized factories had gone elsewhere. And because of the dismantling of the welfare system, there was no safety net. There was no assistance for them. And so the prison became
effectively the social insurance scheme of the late 20th century.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, so many people from countries like Mexico and other countries in Central America began to come to the U.S. Because their home countries were suffering the consequences of global capitalism, the creation of economies based on profit and based on money, rather than the economies based on people's capacity to plant, seeds and support themselves in that way. So all of this came crashing down, and it seems that this had an impact on white working class people as well. I mean, I'm actually an honorary member of the International Longshore Workers Union.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because they've been so amazing in terms of standing up and challenging South African apartheid, and
right.
Also they refused to unload ships coming from South Africa, coming from Israel, and they supported me when I was in jail. So
real community of faith.
Exactly.
So I think like that's sort of what I'm pointing to. Like even if you're an apologist for sort of industrial capitalism and you don't pay attention to the kind of underclass it requires, right? The story that you tell about the United States from kind of 1920 to 1980 is if you could get a high school degree, you could basically enter the middle of the income distribution. You could enter the middle class. Now, I think if we're being honest, that's really the white male kind of breadwinner who attains that. But when I think about how that constituency in the U.S. and it's kind of equivalent in other economies, the kind of leader they're responding to, it strikes me that they're responding both to the kind of share of economic rent they've given up, in the industrial system, but also to just all the ways they feel unmoored. Like I think about in this country, like the incredible fixation over it within conservative circles around transgender people, non-binary people, right? It's sort of like if you can't count on gender or something, then what can you? I think it speaks to the feeling of feeling not just economically dislocated, but socially dislocated. Right. And I guess, sort of building on what you're saying, like how do we don't want to go back, right? Because that system wasn't working for everybody. In fact, it depended on the profound subjugation of an enormous number of people. So to your point about how we haven't been responsive enough, like what's the way to respond to people here or in other countries who feel economically dislocated, who feel sort of culturally dislocated and overwhelmed? What's the way to respond to them without giving in to like their invidious and reactionary impulses, right? Like what we don't want to say is, yes, let's rebuild a social order where you're back on top of someone else. But we do want to say, you have been deprived of critical pathways to prosperity, to your entitlement to prosperity, and also we recognize that you feel overwhelmed, by the pace and character of change. We want to give you.
But I think we've forgotten about the pandemic now.
Uh-huh.
It's like
I agree with that.
It's like it exists in another era.
Right, it's a different dimension.
And the massive uprisings that took place during that period, the 2020, where more people were out in the streets protesting than at any other time in the history of this country, and more white people were standing up against racism. And we're understanding the nature of institutional racism.
Right, that was the difference to me in 2020. That sort of a white middle class began to understand what it meant for racism to be a structural phenomenon.
Exactly.
That animus is not the only or critical
and
driver.
Working class as well. Working class as well.
Yeah.
And so I think this is why we've seen such an enormous pushback by the ultra-right, and the focus on critical race theory, and the focus on banning books, because those demonstrations demonstrated. They demonstrated.
It's working.
They demonstrated against the racism which they were understanding which we were all understanding for the first time as something really necessary to the history of this country.
Right.
In a sense, it was as if we were doing what should have been done in the immediate aftermath of slavery.
Right, so some of what these leaders, kind of sort of racially revanchist leaders, I think what's motivating them, I think, is the protection of an order that they believe is natural, first of all, that they certainly believe benefits them. It seems to me that though they're exploiting a group of people who may feel some of those feelings, but who may also just not feel seen and recognized. And so
Well, I think it's all of that.
it's all of
It's
that.
all of that.
And so how do you, I guess one of the things it seems like we're struggling with actually sort of in progressive movements and communities is how do we find ways to recognize people who don't feel recognized without giving in to the negative impulses that sense of dislocation or lack of recognition make them.
I mean, that's called organizing to me.
I hear you, but how do
You know?
but we're struggling, right? It seems like we're struggling. I think this election is bringing into relief a way in which we're struggling to organize effectively around what you're pointing out could be one of the most propitious moments in a
Absolutely.
generation for progress. Like,
Absolutely.
what are we missing, or what do we need to start doing? Do you think?
Okay, this is a complicated conversation because the means of communication have transformed. And so, we have the centrality of social media that gets used, both, by the revanchists and can be used positively by those who want to create a movement that promises a better world for everyone. But I think it's especially important for activists to recognize that they can't, I consider myself an organizer too, that we can't work as we always have. We have to be really sensitive to the ways in which problems of so many different groups of people converge. So what are the connections between the racism that we've been talking about and the suffering that white working class people are experiencing?
Right.
And we used to do that work by having conversations like this. And now, of course, that seems to be something of the past, that it's done online, which can't be. I think it's important that the technologies of communication have changed, and there are many other possibilities that have been announced by those technological transformations. But at the same time, it becomes really difficult to create human communication.
And real recognition. Right.
Yeah.
And we haven't found technology has created new ways for us to communicate, but hasn't quite replaced the ability of sustained interaction to create mutual recognition.
And learning, education, because that is what happens in the course of the best kind of organizing. Education happens both on the part of the people who are being organized and on the part of the organizers who begin to learn new things about the world in the process of doing that. It's all very complicated, but at the same time, I would say that we have made a lot of progress. We've made a lot of progress in our understanding of some of these deep issues. And the fact that during this period, there's a sense of the importance of LGBTQ issues, feminist issues broadly, that we could have never imagined 25, 30 years ago. That tells us something about the fact that it is possible to encourage people to think differently. Who would have imagined in the time I was an organizer in the 1960s and 1970s that we would be talking about trans issues, and that would become so important, not only because of the particular oppression that trans people have suffered, but because it lets us know that we can challenge that which is utterly normal. That we can figure out how to dismantle the very foundations of normalcy in our society. And so I'm very happy about that. The implications of that for all kinds of movements. But of course, then there's the issue of the work that the ultra right has done
Yeah.
but it is a response.
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to point out that this is a reaction. It's literally a reaction.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
reaction to those who are moving in the direction in a historical direction that can potentially change the world. And there are those who feel very threatened by that.
Yeah.
And that is why we've seen all of the book bannings and the effort to the discourse around toilets and
Yeah,
all of these
exactly.
issues.
Right. Right. Do you? I mean, so I guess I kind of want to end in a way where we began, which is your parents clearly have a whatever it is that motivates them. Your parents are communicating to you clearly from kind of your earliest memories that you are an agent in this world, that your agency extends to imagining the world being different and taking action to make that happen. When you think about, I think it's exciting to think that we are bending history. That we that the moments of retrenchment are a reaction, and that what movements around the world are doing are pushing the world forward. What are, what is it? What should we be imparting on, the 11-year-old of today? The person who is at once awakening to, maybe very similar to you at that age, both an expanded sense of possibility amidst privation and repression, but also an incredibly powerful counterforce. A counterforce that is organizing itself to resist changes that are underway. What would my oldest kid is 9. I think about, like, what should I learn from your parents and what you gained from that experience to help them become the kind of protagonists that you've been able to become, and that people who came up in the world with you have been able to become.
Well, I think it's about education in the broadest sense of the term. And education, in my opinion, is about learning to question the world. It's not about a kind of acquisition of an accumulation of facts. It's about learning how to engage in the process of questioning everything. And if we can't learn to impart to young people this practice of questioning, not to take anything for granted, not even the what might be considered to be the most fundamental basis of our sense of what constitutes the normal. If we can't impart that, and of course that means that we have to constantly, those of us who see ourselves as participating in the process of education, we also have to learn to question ourselves. And I always like to point out that I learned, I think, more from younger people than I think I impart in that process. So I think being in touch with young people is always so inspiring, because they are the ones who really depend on a better future. That is that is their own sense of possibility.
I take less for granted.
Exactly. And so those of us who are older need to learn how to learn from them and take them seriously. And we were talking about Palestine and a little while ago. And for years and years and years, there was such a silence, except in certain circles. And then suddenly, young kids on campuses all across the country begin to, question, what is going on in the Middle East right now, what is happening in Gaza, and lots of young Jewish kids, which was very heartening for me. Because I went to a Jewish college, and the very first white people that I ever knew were Jewish, and I learned to value many aspects of Jewish history and Jewish culture. I think that we always have to look forward and look to those who represent the future, because they are the ones who will lead us in the best possible direction.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Davis.